Good evening. We can measure our own spiritual progress by certain signs, and one of the first is whether we have learned to tell the difference between polishing the mind and entering the presence. I am not here to condemn sincerity. I am not here to belittle those earnest hours you and I have spent trying to keep the mind on the sunny side of the street. Many of us have come that way, and it is understandable. But now, let us look at a hidden mechanism that, after enough years of watching it, you see so much of it that you know definitely it delays inner freedom. The mechanism is this. Positive thinking keeps you operating inside the finite mind, and if the mind remains the method, the mind remains the master. When you stop to think of the way we have been trained, control your thoughts, replace the negative with the positive, crowd out the dark with light words. It sounds wise. It sounds safe. It sounds as if, by mastering a mental vocabulary, we will force God to answer. But God is not reached by mental reach. Christ is not realized by mental mastery. Smoother thoughts are not the same as spiritual realization. You can improve the weather of the mind by driving clouds from one corner to the other, but you have not changed the climate of consciousness. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Where the Spirit of the Lord isn't, there is mortality. Never forget that. Our aim here is not better moods, not improved affirmations, not the ingenuity of selecting brighter words when life grows dim. Our aim is the birth of Christ consciousness, God contact made conscious, the living awareness of I within your own being. Something the Master called I. That I is life. Harmony begins not when the mind achieves a positive pitch, but when presence is contacted. As soon as contact is established, the authority of fear diminishes, the tyranny of thought relaxes, and the governance of I over mind and body begins to be felt. Now, let me illustrate the measuring rod, because we must be practical. It is not measured by how intensely you can think, nor by how long you can keep a sentence running in your head. It is measured by remembrance, by the frequency with which you acknowledge God in all thy ways, by the steadiness with which, in the midst of ordinary hours, you return to I. It isn't too difficult to be positive in the morning after a good night's rest. The difficult thing begins an hour later when the first irritation knocks, and again 2 hours later when fear suggests a plan and demands you execute it mentally. There is your measure. Do you drop the plan and yield? Or do you double your thoughts? So our promise in this work is simple and exacting. We are moving from mental manipulation to yielding, from trying to make something happen by the cleverness of thought, to letting spirit be revealed in the surrender of thought. Don't allow the mind to pose as your savior. Let it become your instrument. And we will, step by step, establish a rhythm of remembrance that opens consciousness to Christ more surely than any campaign of positive words. We will learn to recognize, to yield, and to stand in I. And that is our beginning. Now, let us look directly at the loop, because unless we see it, we will go on turning the same crank and wondering why the machine never produces bread. The moment you meet a negative thought with a positive thought, you have already consented to the first lie. That thought has power over life. You have conferred dominion on the battlefield itself. You have said, in effect, if I do not counteract you, you will act upon me. And from that instant, you are a ward of the mind. Your freedom is now contingent upon a counter-thought. That is not freedom. That is vigilant slavery. When you stop to think of it, What are we doing when we hold a good thought because a bad thought appeared? We are acknowledging a universe of threat and then building a mental fence. We are not in God contact. We are in fear management. We are saying, disaster is possible, therefore I will keep repeating safety. Perhaps the weather of the mind clears for a moment. The sky brightens. Yes, words do chase clouds. But after enough years of it, you see so much of it that you know definitely you have not changed the climate of consciousness. You have not touched the presence that makes discord impotent. You have only moved furniture in a dark room. Now let me illustrate that. A bill arrives, and instantly a shadow thought. There won't be enough. Quickly you answer, there is abundance, there is abundance. Notice what you have done. You have accepted the authority of the first thought to decree a condition. You have set the mind to governing life by decree and counter-decree. Or a medical report says, incurable, and the mind, frightened, begins, perfect health, perfect health. You have made health a product of verbal effort. That is not the way of spirit. Life governs the body, I governs mind and body. When the I within is consciously contacted, the mind becomes an instrument, not a monarch. Then thoughts have their proper place, useful, practical, but not saviors. This is the contrast. Either the mind attempts to govern life, or life, the I of your being, governs mind and body. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Where the Spirit of the Lord isn't, there is mortality. That is true in the optimistic hour and in the pessimistic hour. Cheerful words spoken in the absence of presence leave you in mortality. Never forget that. Do not misunderstand me. We are not teaching pessimism. We are not advocating a darker set of words. We are teaching transcendence beyond the pairs, beyond good thoughts and bad thoughts altogether, into that dimension where presence is the climate. In that climate, the same bill, the same report, the same world news enter a different atmosphere and are dissolved in a different law. Therefore, don't allow yourself to be drawn into skirmishes of phrases. Don't fight thoughts. Stand back within yourself and acknowledge, I have a mind. This mind is mine. I am not its captive. Rest a moment. Yield. Let silence have you. Then, in that quiet, the sense of I begins to govern. And without pushing, without forcing, you find the weather settling because the climate has changed. It isn't too difficult to do that now, here, listening. The difficult thing begins an hour later when the next suggestion arrives. That is where you will discover whether you are managing fear with bright words or entering God contact with surrender. And that is the diagnosis. Now we must come to the great reframe. Because unless this is clear, we will go on blaming ourselves for not being clever enough with thoughts. When you stop to think of the state of the human scene, sin, disease, death, poverty, accidents, if you say that God is there as author, you are in a horrible position of blaming God for our ills. After enough years of watching this world, you see so much of it that you know definitely this cannot be God's doing. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Where the Spirit of the Lord isn't, there is mortality. Therefore, what characterizes human suffering is not divine punishment, not a lack of moral worth, not a shortage of optimism. It is an absence. There is little or no God presence or God power consciously realized in those places. An absence of God contact. Now, let me illustrate that, because it must be practical. A room is dark. You could spend the night describing the darkness, naming shades of black, pushing the furniture, repeating, "It's bright, it's bright," and you will still be walking into chairs. Darkness is not a thing to be resisted. It is the absence of light. The instant you make contact with a source, the darkness is gone without a fight. So it is with our inner life. As soon as a contact with God is established, harmony is restored. Not by willpower, not by brighter sentences, but because presence changes the climate in which the trouble was claiming authority. Never forget that. If you approach life as a contest of mental skill, you confirm the very absence you wish to heal. Self-help, in its sincere way, persuades you that method is the savior. Learn the technique, rehearse the phrase, quicken the tempo of your thinking, and perhaps the weather of the mind improves. But it delays, because it teaches you to stay with the mind as instrument and to ignore the necessity of communion. It is as if you polish the mirror and never turn to the sun. You may see a sharper image of your own striving, but you do not receive light. We are not asked to think our way into God. We are asked to yield. Acquaint now thyself with him and be at peace is not an order to outshout fear. It is an invitation to contact. And here is the promise I stake my life on. As soon as conscious contact is made, you will find areas of strain loosening, conditions shifting. Not because you have improved your mental horsepower, but because you have entered where spirit is law. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty, in body, in mind, in affairs. Where the Spirit of the Lord isn't, mortality continues, no matter how positive the vocabulary. Therefore, the question before us changes entirely. It is no longer, how do I think better? How do I keep a good thought going? The question is, how do I yield so that God may be known within me? How do I stand still long enough and often enough that the absence is replaced by presence? That is our way forward. Paul drew a line in the sand that cannot be smudged by our enthusiasm for better thoughts. He says very clearly, "The natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, neither can he know them, for they are spiritually discerned." That is not a rebuke to intelligence. That is a map of faculties. It says that the mind, as mind, cannot receive spirit because spirit does not come in on the wavelength of mental argument, emotion, or sensation. Spirit is not received by improving the natural mind. Spirit is received by transcending it. When you stop to think of it, what is this natural man? It is the mind-bound sense of self that lives by appearances. It trusts what it can see, hear, taste, touch, and smell, and then builds its theology from that evidence. It reasons from moods and from headlines, from medical charts and bank balances, from the memory of yesterday's injury and the anticipation of tomorrow's fear. It grows excited at good reports and sinks at bad ones. It calculates, it compares, it debates. And when it becomes religious, it tries to think its way into God by arranging brighter sentences within the same field of sense. That is still the natural man. Never forget that. Positive thinking, sincere as it may be, lives largely in that arena. It negotiates with appearances rather than yielding them. It says to fear, "I will out-talk you." It says to lack, "I will outthink you." It says to pain, "I will overlay you with affirmations." And for a moment, the weather of the mind may improve. But the climate of consciousness remains human if there has been no contact. Belief rearranges opinions. Realization changes being. Believing God is good is not the same as feeling the immanence of God within. The quiet assurance that does not argue because presence itself is the answer. Paul does not tell us to dress the natural man in spiritual phrases. He tells us that a different faculty must awaken. To be carnally minded is death. To be spiritually minded is life and peace. Spiritually minded does not mean a more agile mind. It means that the center of awareness has slipped out of the seesaw of opinions into the stillness where spirit is law, where God is not a concept to be defended, but a presence to be felt, known, and obeyed. Now, let me illustrate that. You can read the word honey all afternoon. You can recite its chemical components and memorize its flavor notes. But until the tongue meets sweetness, you have only belief, only description. In the same way, you can repeat, "God is here," with perfect diction. But until the inward ear hears and the inward heart stills, it remains a sentence. The natural man reads the label. The awakened faculty tastes the honey. One is a thought about. The other is direct knowing. Therefore, don't allow the intellect to promise you salvation by better management. Permit it its useful tasks, planning, calculating, reporting, but refuse it the throne. Yield the throne to that which discerns without argument, that which announces itself not by sensation, but by peace. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Where the Spirit of the Lord isn't, no matter how positive the vocabulary, there is mortality. Our work is not to polish the natural man. Our work is to let it be still until the other faculty speaks. And when it speaks, you will not be debating. You will be knowing. Now, let me illustrate that. Not long ago, a letter came from a man at the top of his field, a systems engineer, rational, exact, his life trained to live by data. A routine test had turned into a series of consultations, and then a report laid on his desk with that word stamped across it in clinical type. Incurable. He did what his mind had been taught to do. He opened journals, read survival curves, compared protocols, constructed probabilities. He did it honestly. And when you stop to think of it, what other conclusion can a faithful accountant draw from columns of figures? His mind was not wicked, it was competent. But competence met a wall. The best it could offer was a slope downward, with a range of months and a dark horizon. In the night, he would try sentences, bright, brave, and sometimes they buoyed him an hour or two. But at 3 a.m, when the house was still, the label ruled the room. After enough years of this work, you see so much of it that you know definitely what the mind does at that wall. It either collapses into fear, or it paints the wall with slogans. The paint is pretty for a day. The wall remains. Positive thinking can be a kind sedative. It can settle the weather for an afternoon. But the climate of consciousness doesn't change until a higher contact is made. The authority behind incurable is not the cell report. It is our faith in the finality of mind. The mind can analyze the problem. It cannot touch the presence that nullifies the problem's authority. Never forget that. When you stop to think of it, the intellect is magnificent at what it is designed for. It measures, compares, calculates. It remembers yesterday and projects tomorrow. It can estimate risk. It can count losses and gains. It can even learn religious vocabulary and repeat it on time. But it cannot reach beyond itself to the infinite. The mind itself, being finite, cannot embrace infinity. It is a map reader, not a maker of new country. It can describe the path. It cannot deliver the traveler to God. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Where the Spirit of the Lord isn't, no matter how many positive forecasts you prepare, there is mortality. Now, broaden it. Not only disease, Sin that has rehearsed itself for 20 years seems final to the mind. Lack with bills stacked high seems final to the mind. Loneliness at a table set for one seems final. Addiction with its cycle of attempt and relapse seems final. Bereavement, and yes, the fact of death itself, appears as the final word to the natural man. The mind stands before these and does what it does: arranges, improves odds, distracts, bargains. But it cannot contact the one who speaks with authority and not as the scribes. As soon as a contact with God is established, harmony is restored. Not because we have argued the wall down, but because another law has been felt within. Again, be gentle with yourself. You may find a brave sentence helpful as a kindness to the nerves. Use it as a blanket if you must. But don't allow it to be your savior. The savior is not a better thought. The savior is the realized presence. In our friend's case, the turning did not begin with a new set of phrases. It began the hour he put the journals aside and sat very still, not forcing, not pleading, resting in the word I, listening. At first, nothing. Then, by degrees, a quiet that was not of his making. He found decisions rising without strain, fear loosening its grip, a different rhythm governing his days. He had not conquered the verdict. The verdict had lost its power in the light of presence. Thereafter, practical evidences began to appear, as they do. Faith gives way to evidence, and evidence ripens into a knowing. Now, what is that in us which knows? It is not the improved mind. It is a different faculty awakened by stillness and surrender. And to that we must now turn. Now we turn to the faculty that does the actual knowing of God. When you stop to think of it, the mind is a superb clerk. It can file, compare, project, and rehearse. But it cannot step out of itself to embrace infinity. The mind itself, being finite, cannot embrace infinity. It requires a different faculty than the faculty of the human mind. Call it spiritual sense, intuition, inner awareness. Names are not important. What is important is to see that this faculty is awakened not by straining after thoughts, but by stillness and surrender. God is not reached by mental reach. God is revealed when the inner ear opens, when the heart grows quiet enough that presence can announce itself. Now let me illustrate that in familiar terms. Watch the inventor who hits a wall in the laboratory. She has exhausted the equations, tuned every variable, and then, at midnight, she pushes the papers away and sits very still. In that interval, an answer rises whole, not pieced together by argument but given, as if something within her own being handed her the missing key. Or the composer who wrestles with a theme all week, then awakens with the melody complete. Or the scientist, Einstein confessed it, Edison confessed it, who admits that pivotal advances come not from the linear chain of logic alone, but from a flash, an intuition, a leap that reason later explains. They must, for their true breakthroughs, touch a source of inspiration within themselves that cannot be seen, heard, tasted, touched, or smelled. It announces itself by rightness, by peace, by the effortless fit of the parts. That is not superstition. That is the transcendent moving through a receptive faculty. Prayer, in its deepest sense, is of that order. It is not a speech about God. It is the silencing of speech, so that God may be known. It is not argument. It is acquiescence. It is not affirmations stacked against fear. It is the yielding that lets presence be presence. When you stop to think of it, most of what goes by the name of prayer in our early years is really an attempt to persuade deity by well-arranged words. But as soon as you slip into the quiet and cease from language, something else can happen. Consciousness opens to the withinness of God. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Where the Spirit of the Lord isn't, though the words be beautiful, there is mortality. Here we must unmask a hidden pride in positive thinking. It whispers, "My mental skill will produce God's result. If I combine courage with the right sequence of phrases, I can secure the blessing." No, don't allow that. That is the natural man bargaining for spirit on mental terms. Grace is not the wage of mental labor. Grace is the fruit of contact. And contact is made when we surrender the throne we have given to thought and bow inwardly to that which knows before thought. What then is the doorway to this faculty? Identity. Not the identity of a clever mind, but the recognition of I, the Christ within, as the life of your life. The moment you acknowledge, even faintly, I am not a thinking machine trying to reach God. I am the I through which God reveals himself. A shift begins. The mind loosens. The inner ear grows attentive. You will find that as you rest in that I, softly, without forcing, the transcendental faculty awakens of itself. It is not manufactured. It is recognized. And as soon as even a thin contact is felt, the weather of thoughts loses its tyranny because a new climate is present. The climate of spirit. Now we come to identity, because unless identity is clarified, the mind will keep volunteering for a job it cannot do. When you stop to think of it, most of our trouble springs from misidentification. We have thought ourselves to be a body trying to get spiritual, a thinker trying to think its way to God. That is backwards. Life itself is God, something the Master called I. That I is life. You are not a body seeking spirit. You are I, spirit, having a body and having a mind. Now let me illustrate that because it must be concrete. Say within yourself, quietly, I have a body. Not the other way around. I have a body. Then, I have a mind. This mind is mine. My mind is mine. It is an instrument, not a monarch. Don't allow that subtle reversal by which the instrument dictates to the musician. Don't allow that. You were given dominion over the body and over the mind. The moment you accept that you are the I that has a mind, you have shifted the seat of authority. Freedom begins there, not when you fight thoughts, but when you stand as the I that governs them. This alone explains why positive thinking often fails. It tinkers with the content of thought while leaving the throne in the same place. It polishes the words while the mind still presides. You can repaint the sign on a building. You have not changed the owner. You can fill your head with brighter sentences. You have not moved out of subjection to the very arena you are trying to fix. As long as the mind remains the method, the mind remains the master. And the natural man, however optimistic, cannot receive the things of spirit. Never forget that. Spiritual dominion is not bullying the mind with stronger affirmations. Spiritual dominion is government from presence. The I is the point of contact where God is felt and known. And from that contact, a quiet authority begins to permeate mind and body. Then thought takes its rightful place, useful when sent for, silent when not. The body, too, senses a new government. Breath eases, tensions unclench. Because you have ceased trying to drive life with mental reins and have yielded to the I in the midst of you that knows before thought. Now let me show the practical turn. The issue from this moment is remembrance. How often in the ordinary hour you return to I and acknowledge presence. It isn't too difficult to say in this room, "I have a mind, my mind is mine." The difficult thing begins an hour later when a rush of notions claims you. In that instant, don't fight the thoughts. Stand back within yourself and recognize, I. Even 1 second of that recognition alters the climate. The weather of the mind may still flicker, but the climate of consciousness has changed, and you will notice that thoughts which demanded battle lose their compulsion under government. Measure your progress by the frequency and swiftness of that return. 12 times a day, 24, begin again. I have a body. I have a mind. This mind is mine. I and the Father are one. Not to argue, but to acknowledge. And as you do, you will find that what you could not accomplish by managing content begins to happen of itself under the government of presence. Because you are not wrestling in the mind, you are resting in I. Now we must speak of the way conviction matures, because many grow discouraged when they do not yet feel what others testify. In the beginning, it is faith. It still is in the realm of faith. You stand within yourself and acknowledge, I, even when the senses shout otherwise. You trust that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty, though the outer picture has not yielded. That is not pretense, that is orientation. It points you toward the only door, contact. Then, as you yield and yield again, evidences appear, what in modern language are called demonstrations. Now let me illustrate that. Yesterday, panic would have ruled an entire afternoon. Today, after a 2-minute yielding, the panic loosens and work proceeds in quiet. Last month, a due date felt like doom. This month, following an inner stillness, an unplanned phone call, a delayed fee, a right idea appears. Supply, not by magic but by order, begins to take its rightful form. A pain that has insisted for weeks softens after a period of resting in I, not because you bullied it with phrases, but because another climate was present. One occurrence could be passed off as coincidence, but after enough years of it, you see so much of it that you know definitely something consistent is operating. Repeated restoration of harmony follows inner yielding. That is evidence. As these evidences begin to pile up, our convictions deepen. Faith is no longer a noble guess. It becomes a practical trust born of experience. You do not argue as much. You turn more quickly to the one method that has shown itself to be no method at all, but communion, yielding to I. Never forget that. Spiritual maturity is not a stronger belief. It is repeated contact that becomes verifiable evidence, and then direct knowing. Why do people stall at faith? Because they substitute campaigns of positivity for the practice that produces evidence. They talk brightly about God while remaining absent from God contact. Or they make a morning splash of devotion and then live 12 hours in forgetfulness, measuring progress by intensity instead of remembrance. It isn't too difficult to feel quiet for 10 minutes now. The difficult thing begins an hour later when the phone rings, the news breaks, the body speaks. In that hour, you will either return, gently, simply, or you will try to think your way out. Evidence comes to the one who returns. Now, understand this rhythm. At first, moments of contact come and go. Do not be troubled by that. The light seems to flicker because the hand on the switch is untrained. The work is not to force the light to stay. The work is to return to the switch again and again until turning becomes natural, until the climate of presence begins to abide. And then, no one can schedule this. One bright day or one bright night, the very presence announces itself unmistakably. Not as a sensation that can be seen, heard, tasted, touched, or smelled, but as a knowing that stills argument at its root, as peace that requires no proof because it is proof. Thereafter you will say, not merely, I believe, not only, I have had evidences, but, I know. And from that hour, remembrance is easier, because you are returning to a someone you have met, not a theory you admire. Now we face the difficult thing. Not the 10 minutes after a good meditation. Not the quiet that follows an inspiring talk. It isn't too difficult to be at peace in this room, to feel the warmth of agreement and the ease of stillness. The difficult thing begins an hour later, when the phone rings, when a headline shouts, when the body speaks, when a memory stirs. In that hour, you will learn what your practice is made of. And in that hour, understand this: the real battle is not with negative thoughts. The real battle is with forgetfulness of presence. Don't allow the mind to persuade you that managing thought content is your salvation. Your progress is measured by how often you return to presence, not by how powerfully you try to think. When you stop to think of it, intensity is a poor ruler. Some days you will feel nothing unusual, no glow, no vision, and yet you may return a dozen times, 24, to a simple inner acknowledgement of I. That is progress. Another day you may have a dramatic moment and then spend 6 hours in forgetfulness. That is not progress. We can measure our own spiritual progress by a definite sign. By the degree of success in remembering God, acknowledging Him in all thy ways, right in the midst of ordinary hours. The weather of the mind goes up and down. The climate of consciousness shifts only as remembrance becomes steady. Now, let me illustrate how positive thinking distracts. A problem appears, and the mind rushes to arrange, to project, to overlay with brighter sentences. Notice what that does. Attention fastens on outcomes, on the check that must come, on the symptom that must cease, on the person who must change. The source is forgotten. You can spend the afternoon polishing the mirror and never turn to the sun. You can count affirmations and never make contact. Don't allow that. Never argue with appearances. Never rehearse fear. Never let the mind become your tyrant. You have a mind. This mind is yours. Send it to its tasks when needed. Silence it when not. One gentle return to I stills more argument than 100 counterthoughts. So the guardrails are simple. Do not enter debate with the picture. Do not dress fear in religious words by repeating it to yourself in holy tones. Step back within. Acknowledge, even for 1 second, I and the Father are one. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. That second is worth 10 minutes of verbal fencing. And if you fail and forget, begin again. The victory is in the return. From this point, our discipline becomes practical. Morning recognition, before the eyes meet the world, a few quiet minutes in which you remember I as the life of your life. Then, during the day, an hourly remembrance. A pause on the hour if possible, or as near to it as life allows. Just long enough to acknowledge presence without words, or with one word, I. And then before sleep, a closing acknowledgement. Sealing the day not with a list of worries, but with a return. This is not intensity. This is rhythm. And by the steadiness of that rhythm, you will find the climate changing. Not because you have outthought the world, but because presence has been consciously welcomed into it. Now we make it a rule of life. Not a treatment, not a technique to bend events, but a rhythm that keeps the channel open. In the morning, before the eyes meet the world, give 10 or 15 minutes to conscious recognition, not asking, not declaring programs for the day, simply recognition. Father, thou art here. Then be still. Let the words fall inside like a stone in a quiet pool, and watch the rings widen. I and the Father are one. Not said to convince, but to acknowledge what is already so. Sit with that. Resist the impulse to decorate it with many sentences. This is not a speech, it is a yielding. If thoughts begin to assemble their lists, don't argue. Gently set them down and return to I. A few minutes of that, truly given, sets the climate for the day more surely than any parade of affirmations, because you have started with presence rather than with plans. Now, the difficult thing begins an hour later. Therefore, establish an hourly practice. Set a reminder if you must. Watch, chime, the turning of a page, anything that will call you home. When the signal comes, stop wherever you are, on the sidewalk, at the desk, in the kitchen, and become still for half a minute if you can. No strain, no hunt for feelings. A return. I. Or softly, Father, thou art here. Then listen. That is all. You are not trying to think a better thought. You are consenting to the presence that governs thought. These pauses keep life from becoming mind-driven again. They prevent the instrument from climbing back onto the throne. Acknowledging Him in all thy ways is not a slogan. It is this very habit of turning, and by it, the channel of God contact stays open. At night, do not retire to sleep without the seal. Close the day as you began it, in recognition and surrender. Review nothing to condemn. Rehearse nothing to fix. Simply place the day with its lights and shadows into God. Father, all that I am and have is thine. Thou art here. Gratitude will arise of itself, not manufactured, as the nervous system lays its burdens down. This sealing does something very practical. It dismisses the mind from night watch so that deeper rhythms may restore. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Even in sleep, law operates, and you have consented to it. Never forget what this is not. It is not a series of affirmations to manipulate conditions. It is not bargaining. It is not mental force. It is surrender to presence, and presence reveals harmony. When you stop to think of it, a campaign of positive thoughts merely polishes the weather of the mind. This rule of life alters the climate of consciousness. Morning recognition, hourly yielding, nightly sealing. Simple, steady, doable. By this rhythm, Christ is consciously welcomed, and under that government, mind and body find their right order without your management. The victory is not in effort. The victory is in the return. Now we come to the moment of test. Fear shouts. It arrives with a headline, a ping on the phone, a pain in the body, a memory that stings. The old training rushes in. Argue with it, negotiate with it, paint over it with a brighter sentence. Don't allow that. The answer to fear is not a better thought. It is the return to I, where presence dissolves fear's claim. When you stop to think of it, answering fear with a more positive fear is still fear in religious clothing. It keeps the arena mental, and as long as the mind remains the method, the mind remains the master. So here is the real-time instruction. When the crisis thought rises, do not wrestle it. Do not arrange a speech for it. Become still, if only for a breath. Drop the shoulders a fraction. Let the gaze soften. Turn within and acknowledge I, or Father, thou art here. Nothing more. You are not managing content. You are shifting the seat of attention from the flurry of mind to the I that has a mind, from the picture that threatens to the presence that governs. In that second, you have yielded the throne. Mind argues, spirit reveals. Mind forecasts, spirit is present. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Now let me illustrate that, because the battlefields are familiar. A health report arrives with unfriendly numbers. The mind begins to compute timelines. Don't answer with, I am strong and healthy, I am strong and healthy, as if shouting will drown the figures. Pause. I. A bill posts. The balance is thin, the calendar relentless. The mind sprints into worst-case futures, or chants, money is coming, to drown the panic. Don't. Pause. I. A relationship flares, words said, accusations made. The mind drafts rebuttals or tries to paste cheery phrases on a wounded heart. Don't. Pause. I. Guilt creeps in from an old failure, whispering, this defines you. The mind argues for innocence or rehearses self-punishment dressed as humility. Don't. Pause. I. In each case, you are relocating identity. You have a mind. This mind is yours. You, the I, are not a frightened bundle of thoughts. You are the life through which God reveals himself. As you stand there, quietly, without strain, the weather inside begins to change because the climate has changed. Decisions will still be made, phone calls returned, bills handled, amends offered, but under government rather than under compulsion. You will find that what needed to be done announces itself without debate, and the heat is gone from the hour. Never forget that the saving element is not the brilliance of a sentence, it is the contact. Again, do not measure by sensation. Measure by remembrance. 1 second of honest yielding in the midst of crisis is more fruitful than 10 minutes of mental fencing. Return, 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 and you will see, after enough years of it, that fear's authority weakens on sight, because there is a new government in the midst of you. Now, for a few moments, let us meditate. Now, become very simple. Relax the shoulders a fraction. Let the jaw loosen. Soften the breath. We are not reaching for a result. We are not trying to make something happen. We are consenting to what is. Don't allow the mind to start forming a program or hunting for a feeling. Let it rest. For a few moments, your only work is to be here, quiet, receptive. Now, imagine, just imagine, that you are seated up here, above the forehead, a little above the crown, looking down gently at the stream of thoughts. As if you were sitting in a balcony watching a stage. The actors come and go, memories, forecasts, to-dos, fears, bright ideas. You do not join them. You do not drive them away. You watch. You remain seated, up here. When you stop to think of it, the watcher is not disturbed by the play. The watcher is at rest. Softly now, within, say the word, I. Not as an ego, not, I, the person, will do great things. No, as listening, as if you were hearing an I come up within you and announce itself. I. Let there be a space after it. Again, gently. I. Allow it to be a bell that rings inside and then leaves a widening quiet. If a thought tries to tack on a sentence, let it fall away. Again, I. You are not producing, you are attending. Now, as you rest in that I, let the ancient assurances rise, not out there, not as quotations on a page, but as the very voice of the I within your own being. Hear them as you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. I go before thee to make the crooked places straight. Be still and know that I am God. Neither do I condemn thee. Let the words speak themselves inside, and then dissolve back into quiet, leaving the sense, the weight of presence. Again, no reaching, just listen. If there is only a faint warmth, a loosening, a small hush under the breastbone, good. That faintness is evidence. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty, and liberty sometimes begins as a feather touch you could almost miss. Do not demand a sign that can be seen, heard, tasted, touched, or smelled. Consent to the stillness that cannot be put in the hand, and notice that you are not quite the same as you were 1 minute ago. The weather has not been argued. The climate has shifted a degree. Return once more, very gently. 1. As if it speaks you into being. I am here. I am life. I govern. Let mind be servant now. Let body rest under government. Nothing to fix, nothing to prove, only presence to acknowledge. We will close this moment without hurry. Stay seated within yourself, up here, watching kindly, listening within. Christ is realized when you stop trying to think God into being and you listen, until the I within becomes conscious presence. Hold to that, lightly, like a hand you do not need to grip because it is already holding you. And when you rise, keep a fragment of this hush as you go. Now we close the circle. When you stop to think of it, the entire arc has been simple, though not easy. Positive thinking becomes a detour because it keeps the mind on the throne. It polishes the weather of thought while leaving the climate unchanged. As long as the mind remains the method, the mind remains the master. Christ is not realized by mental mastery, but by surrender to presence. Yielding restores the throne to the I, Spirit, the life of your life. From that government mind and body take their rightful places, and harmony begins to appear, not because you have arranged it, but because presence governs. Therefore, the practical test is plain. Today and this week, measure by remembrance, not by how noble your phrases are, not by how dramatic your sensation is, but by how often you stop and acknowledge God in all thy ways. It isn't too difficult to recognize I in a quiet hour. The difficult thing begins an hour later in the noise of the day. So make the return your criterion. 12 times, 24 if you can, pause and whisper within, I, or Father, thou art here. Then listen. That 1 second of honest yielding does more than many minutes of mental effort, because it reopens the channel of contact. Set your expectation aright. Demonstrations come as the natural fruit of contact. Peace first, always peace first, because where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Then, under that climate, harmonies appear. Mind quieted, body eased, circumstances ordered. Not necessarily spectacular, but steady, observable, cumulative. After enough years of it, you see so much of it that you know definitely a law is operating. Not the law of your cleverness, but the law of presence, functioning where it is welcomed. Now the firm word, and take it personally. Never forget that the power is not in your thought. Don't allow the mind to bully you into campaigns of control. You have a mind. This mind is yours. You, the I, send it to its work and dismiss it to its silence. Refuse debate with appearances. Refuse rehearsals of fear. Return again and again to I. That is your government. That is your safety. That is your sufficiency. And let us end in assurance, not strain. Presence goes before you to make the crooked places straight. It is closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. It will never leave you nor forsake you. Live from contact, not control. Yield, and then walk on in the quiet knowledge that what you could never do by yourself is being done in you and as you and for you by the I of your own being. Thank you.